This video is to talk about pivot points and why they're useful and why they're important, and understanding the difference between certain types of pivot points and how we can move them around. So by default, your objects all have a pivot point. This is where you manipulate your object around. This is where it scales around. This is where it rotates around, right? If I move my pivot point down here, you'll see I'm definitely rotating. It really affects rotation and scaling quite significantly, right? By default, your object's pivot points are going to be in the center of the object until you start doing some heavy edits, right? And then your mesh might change shape, but that pivot point's not going to be moving while you edit your object, right? Your object's pivot point is going to stay in the same spot until you manually move it. And so we also have the pivot point of our selections, right? So if I switch to either the move, rotate, or scale tool, you'll notice my pivot point is going to be the average of my selection by default. So if I select any of these guys, select faces, right? See that pivot point's right in the middle of that object, or of that selection. If I select multiple things, you'll notice the pivot point is going to average between them, right? So you can see it's averaged between those objects, right? I can also see my pivot points in here, right? I can change some of the settings to it in terms of I can edit the pivot points. So even if I wanted to say, let's say I wanted to scale, let's turn off editing my pivot point for a second. Say I wanted to scale this cube up, right? Or this square. And I wanted to scale it, but I didn't want to scale it. I kind of wanted to leave this, like this vertex right here in place, and I want to move these ones up away from it, right? Then what I could do is I can edit my pivot point, turn on snap to point, and then I can move it over here, turn off editing, and then you'll see now instead of, I can keep this vertex that I'm at locked, and then I can still scale those vertices away from each other equally like that, right? Click on reset to bring it back. A lot of times what you'll do is you'll be moving your object around, and your object might not be oriented traditionally, like it might not be oriented to the world, right? So the world, this object's oriented to the world, right? It's lined up with the world's orientation. This one is not. It's off kilter, right? And so when I'm in edit mode, or something like that, I might want to move something relative to a different orientation instead of my object's orientation. So what I can do is I can change my orientation here. This isn't necessarily related to pivoting, but it falls under a similar category. And so I can change my orientation to a different setup. So world, objects, component, which is essentially the thing I have selected. Each of these have their own orientation to them, right? And then I can do some other ones. So let's go, parent would be if it's parented underneath an object. So let's just go back to object, okay? What I can also do with the pivot point is if I click edit, you'll notice when I'm in like a component mode, like vertex, edge, or polygon, or face, what I see when I hover over any of these, you can see you have a line show up. What happens is when you click on that, it's going to move the pivot point, and it's also going to, actually right now what I'm doing is I'm kind of, I still have this guy selected right here. So this vertex right here is still selected. Let's go ahead and try something else. Let's do face. So I'm going to select this face right here. I want to move it. But the problem is this, I kind of want to move it out, like push it out in its own, like kind of almost along its own orientation or its own normal, right? So by default, oh, I'm going to start getting kind of confused. By default, this is not set up, this orientation is not going to be really helping me get that, right? I can turn off snap to point. I can try to move it out and try to get it out like evenly, but it's not going to be very precise. So what I can do is I can go ahead and click edit pivot, and I can click on that polygon, and it's actually going to set that pivot point to be perpendicular and right in the middle of my component, and it's going to be essentially perpendicular to the surface, right? So now if I turn off edit pivot point, you can see it's going to be moving it straight in that polygon's normal, right? I could do the same thing with any of my other components, right? If I, let's say I'm going to grab this face right here, I edit my pivot point. If I click on that face again, I might need to click off, so I can easily click in here, click there, and now you can see that pivot point's that normal. I can also orient it to, if I click on a vertice or an edge, right, it's going to move and orient the pivot point. Sometimes I want to keep the orientation, I just want to move the pivot point. So if I want to do that, I'll hold shift and you see it says POS for position. So it kept the orientation, right? It's just moving it to a different location, right? Or if I like where it is, but I want it to match like a certain orientation of an edge, like let's say a certain edge is pointed in a direction I want, I can hold Control for Orient, and you'll see when I click on that, it's going to copy the orientation of that component, right? And so you can use this in a lot of pretty clever ways to try to get a very specific rotation, or translation direction or scaling direction on a certain selection. Okay, if I need to go back, I'll just click Reset. Sometimes it'll say pin the pivot, and so if you ever accidentally do that, you'll notice you'll start new selections. Whenever you start a new selection, it should reset this, right? But if you're starting a new selection and it's keeping the pivot point in the wrong spot, so if I move this to, let's align my pivot point, turn that off, and I'm selecting new selection, but you can see it kept that pivot point, right? Just make sure you turn that off, because I've definitely done that multiple times before. Okay, so a lot of times what I'll use a pivot point for is if I need to mirror my object across a certain axis, or if I need to snap it to, let's say, the center of my scene, right? So here's the center of my scene. I want this to be in the center of the scene because I'm going to do some mirroring, or I have another object that needs to be aligned with it. So I'm trying to get them both lined up with each other. So what I can do is I can, let's say my pivot point was in a funky spot like up here. Right, let's say my pivot point got messed up. What I can do is I can edit my pivot point. I can go to click on this right here, which is snap to vertices. And then I can just move it to any of my center line vertices, turn off pivoting, or editing the pivot point, and then I'll turn on snap to grid, and then I can just snap it to the center of my scene, right? And now I know it's perfectly in the center of my scene. Obviously, you guys might have looked at this and you might have said, why didn't you just do center pivot, right? So I might just select my object and go modify center pivot, right? That's pretty good. I mean, it's definitely viable. If your object is asymmetrical, though, that won't work, right? You might, if you have an asymmetrical object, you might have a center line, right? So you might have the center of your object, but because of your distribution or the shape of your object, it might not be equal across both sides. So center pivot's not going to account for that. Center pivot is going to, in that case, give you an off-center pivot. It's going to be shift, like if I had more polygons over here, it's going to shift that center point right here. So it's not actually going to be along whatever I deemed to be my center line. Okay. I also like to use it for if I need to rotate or pivot around a specific edge or corner, right? So if I needed to, so one of the examples I was giving was creating like an octagon out of these faces, or out of these shapes, or the shape right here. And so in order to do that, what I would first set the pivot point to be the back corner over here, or wherever I wanted to rotate it around. Because if I rotate it, right, it's going to rotate around its center. But I'm going to kind of treat it like a hinge. So what I'm going to do is press D. I'm going to turn on snap to point, turn off edit pivot point, and you'll see it's acting like a hinge, so I can rotate it like this. So what I'm going to do is I'm essentially going to duplicate my mesh. I'm going to remove it, and then I'm going to rotate it, right? And then I'm going to keep doing that until I get like a hexagon, right? And so it's really handy for if you have a very specific way you need to rotate your object and edit it. So let's just do that really quickly. Turn that off, and then I'm just going to go edit, duplicate special, and I'm going to set this to translate. Let's just see what this looks like first. Okay, I'm probably going to have to spend some time setting this up. Let's see, 8.2. Oh, too much. 5. It's actually pretty close. 5.2. Nope. 5.1. Okay, and that's getting closer. 5.08. Okay, so let's say that's what I wanted. I got the spacing right. Now I need to get them to rotate around, right? So I'm going to translate them units, and then I'm also going to want to rotate them along the y-axis. Let's say I'm making 9 copies, so it's going to be 10 total. And so if I need to go full 360 degrees around, that's 36 degrees per copy. Right? And I click on apply. You'll see it translated it, rotated around that corner or that edge 36 degrees. Then it translated it, rotated around that corner 36 degrees, and then it kept going around until it got back to the beginning. Right? If I didn't set my pivot point to be, if I set it right there in the middle, you'll see when I click on that, that's not exactly, it's not pivoting around this edge right here. So it moved over and then it rotated around its center like that. You guys see that? And so obviously that's not what I needed. So I needed to change that pivot point first. Okay, so the pivot point is very powerful. Another thing I use it for is I use it for straightening edges towards other edges by scaling them, right? So let's say I have a bunch of crazy edges like this, right? In order to straighten them out, what I like to do is I like to flatten them in an axis, right? So I might scale them, right? Problem is this is not straightened to this edge loop now, right? This is kind of off center. I can just move it down, you know, no one's gonna really notice in this case. But in some cases, your mesh might be really dense, and this is going to start causing some distortions. So if you want to get this precise, what I can do is I can move that pivot point, and I'm going to use, I can click on this right here, and let's just do position, shift, click on that. So now it's lined up with this one. And now when I scale to flatten it down, I know it's going to line up perfectly with these two edges right here, right? So it's going to really straighten it out. So I can do the same thing down here, select these guys, I'm going to straighten them so they line up with this guy right here. And I'm just going to press D, hold shift to change the position or make sure I'm getting the position. I'm doing shift instead of just clicking on it because I don't want to get this orientation as well, right? I'm going to line it to this one first so I can get this orientation of the straight line in this direction. And then I'm going to hold shift to grab that position. Scale it. There we go. So I straightened it. Right, so it has a lot of different functionalities, so getting used to the pivot tool is going to really help you with editing your meshes and getting precise topology changes and figuring out how you might want to rotate or move your object. Okay.